Hi, Jessica. We're live, so let's get started.
Hi, hello everyone. It's nice to have you all in here. I am going to start to talk in Spanish. As you know, this webinar is for the Latin America region, so vamos a comenzar. Hola a todos, buenas tardes en Latinoamérica y buenas noches en Europa. Como partners de GRESB, nos sentimos extremadamente honrados de ser los anfitriones de este webinar, pero estamos extremadamente felices porque es el primero de una serie de webinars que prepararemos específicamente por la región. Y bueno, mi nombre es Jessica Díaz Avelar, soy la directora general y cofundadora de PIMA, que es una firma de consultoría en sostenibilidad inmobiliaria, y es un placer estar aquí con ustedes y moderar esta sesión. El objetivo del día de hoy es presentarles el mercado inmobiliario latinoamericano a través de la plataforma de GRESB, así como las tendencias ASG globales que están incidiendo en nuestra región y sobre todo en esta desafiante transformación global que estamos viviendo para que todas las empresas podamos reaccionar proactivamente a ellas, para poder prevenir y atender riesgos y tener los menos impactos negativos en esta transformación y decarbonización, tanto internamente como a nuestros grupos de interés. Aquí está la agenda. Para ello, en breve les vamos a presentar al doctor Drew Sanderford de la Universidad de Virginia, quien nos hablará de estas tendencias, sobre todo de bienes raíces a nivel global y con énfasis en Latinoamérica. Posteriormente tendremos al equipo de GRESB encabezado por Dan Winters, que es el director de GRESB para América, y Víctor Fonseca, que está en GRESB Real Estate. También nos van a dar ellos una introducción de las ventajas y las aplicaciones de GRESB desde nivel activo hasta nivel portafolio, así de cómo los resultados de GRESB tienen tendencias en esto que estamos hablando de lo que está viniendo en aspectos ASG y los resultados de GRESB 2020 que acaban de salir en este mes. Bueno, posterior a ello, como PIMA, queremos darles tips de cómo empezar con el nuevo proceso de evaluación que empieza en abril del año que entra, pero para el cual debemos de estar preparándonos desde ya. Tanto para las empresas que ya han participado en GRESB como para las que no. Y finalmente tendremos una sesión de preguntas y respuestas, así como las conclusiones y recomendaciones de la sesión. Estamos seguros que este primer evento para Latinoamérica será de mucha utilidad para ustedes. Les agradecemos infinitamente su asistencia. Para las preguntas, por favor, vía el chat de la sesión, indíquenos cuáles son durante todo el tiempo de la presentación y al final las vamos a moderar y a responder de la mejor manera posible. Muchas gracias por estar aquí y bueno, vamos a comenzar formalmente. Entonces, para poder comenzar y para poder conocernos un poquito más, vamos a realizar esta encuesta de poll. Pues ya saben, estamos en eventos Zoom ahora todo el tiempo y creo que es muy importante tener este feedback con todos ustedes. Así que les pido que nos apoyen a contestar y son 5 preguntas en donde queremos conocerlos un poco más en cuáles son sus necesidades en aspectos ASG y cómo las están enfrentando. Entonces, empezamos. Les vamos a dar más o menos 1 minuto para cada respuesta. Entonces, si pueden ir contestando, se los agradeceré. Muy bien. Las preguntas son, ¿has oído hablar de GRESB antes? ¿Su empresa informa a alguna plataforma ASG? Ustedes saben que hoy en día son súper conocidas y cada vez hay más. Entonces, si nos pueden decir a cuáles sus empresas reportan. Entonces, muy bien. Muchas gracias y gracias por contestar. Ok. Como pueden ver, ahorita vemos que sí, más del 58, bueno, más del 50% se está moviendo un poquito, ha participado en GRESB o ha escuchado de GRESB. Más bien, más del 50% ha escuchado de GRESB. Estamos viendo que el 40% de la audiencia ya está en GRESB. Después le seguiría Sustainalytics con un 18%, Energy Star con un 12% y después seguido por el Dow Jones Sustainability Index. Entonces, bueno, creo que son cómo se va dando. Muy bien, perfecto. Muy bien, ahorita vemos. Si la gente que se está uniendo apenas no escuchó la introducción, bienvenidos y queremos decirles si pueden contestar estas preguntas. Es un poll inicial para entender cómo sus empresas están liderando los aspectos ASG y cuáles son las tendencias que más tenemos. Solo van a ser 5 preguntas. Les damos muchas gracias por contestar y ya en breve comenzaremos el webinar. Entonces, muy bien. Como pueden ver, pues sí siguen más o menos los porcentajes igual, aunque ya SAM y Sustainalytics se están emparejando, un poco muy parecidos Energy Star, Sustainalytics y otros, pero como podemos ver, pues sí estamos ya todos en la era de reportar aspectos de ASG. ¿Por qué lo estamos haciendo? Pues por 2 razones. Uno, porque realmente necesitamos un backup que indique cómo está nuestro desempeño ASG y por otro lado, porque pues también los inversionistas lo están solicitando, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, vamos bien. Ahorita ya se va a acabar el tiempo para estas preguntas. Sasha, please, whenever you want, we can change to the other questions. Okay, perfect. So we have end these questions. As you can see, como pueden ver, perdón, voy a estar brincando un poco entre inglés y español. Pueden ver que 67% de la audiencia conoce GRESB, el 43% de ella ya reporta en GRESB, y bueno, los demás porcentajes entre Energy Star, Sustainalytics y SAM podemos decir que están muy parecidos. Pues bueno, esto da a ver cómo sí hay una gran tendencia a estar reportando, ¿no? También en otros. Entonces, bueno, we can go to the next question, Sasha, if you want, or Anna.
All of the questions have been answered. You just have to scroll down a little bit.
Yes, thank you. Okay, perfect. Ok, bueno, entonces, como podemos ver aquí en la pregunta 3 que menciona si utilizamos las certificaciones, las calificaciones y los puntos de referencia de estas plataformas como una herramienta o guía para nuestras estrategias ASG, como pueden ver, pues definitivamente es un sí con casi el 70%. Los que contestaron no, creo que es una excelente respuesta y una invitación a que sí ocupen estas plataformas como una guía. Ahorita lo vamos a ver con Dan, Víctor y con Drew, pero es muy importante que ustedes sepan que estas plataformas siempre están basadas en aspectos internacionales de ASG de desempeño, como el Global Reporting Initiative, TCFD, SASB. Entonces, al estar siguiendo estos lineamientos, ustedes perfectamente pueden ir completando su agenda ASG 2030-2050, ¿no? La siguiente pregunta es, ¿qué aspecto ASG es el más desafiante para su empresa? La verdad es que sí sabía que íbamos a tener esta respuesta. El ambiental es el aspecto más desafiante, tenemos 77%. Creo que esto es muy obvio porque el aspecto ambiental es el que menos se consideraba hace algunos años en el business as usual, y pues es súper importante porque el ambiental es el que mide las emisiones de carbono, tanto de energía, de residuos y de agua. Y entonces, si queremos, nuestro fin es decarbonizar la industria, obviamente el aspecto ambiental es el que va a tener más peso. Y si pueden ver en las calificaciones de GRESB del año pasado a este, pues hubo un cambio, y performance indicators, que se basa muchísimo en las cuestiones ambientales, tiene un peso del 70% de la calificación. Entonces, bueno, el social, como pueden ver, y el de gobernanza están empatados con un 23%. Hay menos aspectos que considerar, y también pues en el de gobernanza muchos sí se manejaban en el business as usual, y pues los sociales también es muy importante empezarlos a incorporar, ¿no? Bueno, después veamos la última pregunta. ¿Con qué frecuencia recibe preguntas relacionadas de ASG de los inversionistas? Podemos ver que cada mes o cada trimestre es el 30%. O sea, yo creo que todos los que estamos en este rubro de sostenibilidad hemos visto cómo el último año se han duplicado duplicado, creo que me quedo corta, las necesidades de los inversionistas en aspectos ASG, ¿no? Hace 3 años, pues si recibíamos una encuesta o una solicitud tal vez al semestre, era suficiente o demasiado, y con preguntas pues relativamente subjetivas. Ahora se reciben preguntas, como pueden ver, entre cada trimestre y cada mes muchísimo, y van a seguir aumentando, ¿no? Esta es la tendencia. Entonces, bueno, también si se pueden dar cuenta, 23% contestó que no sabe, tal vez porque no es su área, pero estoy segura que de ese 23%, muchas son que sí están pidiendo y que tal vez ustedes no son quienes las reciben. Y pues bueno, la verdad es que creo que esto fue muy interesante. Nos refleja cómo las tendencias ASG están creciendo. Y bueno, vamos a seguir con nuestra presentación. Muchísimas gracias por contestar. Entonces, bueno, vamos a pasar. Aquí déjenme lo cierro. Ok, bueno. Lo que quiero comentarles aquí es que, como una breve introducción, estamos viendo que justo esto, ¿no? En la última década, y como un parteaguas el 2020, que todos hemos sufrido esta disrupción, estamos pasando de entender los beneficios de los aspectos ASG a realmente obligaciones. Ajá, o sea, si bien hemos estado hablando de temas de sostenibilidad en los últimos 20 años, estos temas realmente no han cambiado mucho. Lo que ha cambiado es quién los está liderando. O sea, estamos pasando de que los empezaba a llevar la gente de mantenimiento, se los colgaban a cualquiera que fuera en la empresa, y ahora se están viendo los aspectos ASG como un tema de riesgo. Entonces, esto ya está transformándose en obligaciones que la industria debe de cumplir para evitar los riesgos financieros, sociales y ambientales, pero mucho más en nuestro sector inmobiliario, que si se fijan en esta gráfica, lo que les muestra es que, contando las construcciones, la operación de los edificios y el carbón embebido, suma más del 70% de las emisiones globales. Entonces, estamos en el ojo del huracán, y somos un sector, pues, el cual la legislación va a cambiar, pues, muy, muy pronto. Ahora, lo del COVID, como nos podemos dar cuenta, es algo que está acelerando esta tendencia, y entonces pues vamos a tener que cambiar y ver que la gestión de riesgos, la resiliencia, la transparencia y el compromiso ambiental y social son cada vez asuntos más relevantes. En un reporte de Real Estate, de The Counselors of Real Estate, lo que se concluye es que los aspectos ASG deben establecerse como una estrategia prudente de mitigación de riesgos para que podamos seguir disfrutando de los beneficios que históricamente el sector inmobiliario ha tenido. Latinoamérica no es la excepción, por el contrario, es una región que necesita acelerar esta transición a aspectos ASG, sobre todo en el sector inmobiliario, ¿no? Y bueno, los bienes raíces son un sector de la transformación. A pesar de que Latinoamérica solo aporta el 5% de las emisiones globales de los gases de efecto invernadero, la región tiene un grado de vulnerabilidad altísima, por lo que debe proponer e implementar metas para reducir y enfrentar los riesgos relacionados. Sin embargo, como nosotros podemos ver, los gobiernos y las acciones para enfrentarlos todavía no son los necesarios. ¿Por qué? Porque la región, evidentemente, como mayoritariamente emergente, necesita cubrir otras necesidades como crisis económicas, de salud, etcétera. Entonces, nosotros como sector privado vamos a tener que acelerar estas cuestiones. Como un ejemplo en Latinoamérica de lo atrasado que está, de los 42 países que la conforman, solo 15 tienen planes de emergencia climáticos o los llamados NDCs. Entonces, debemos de entender que los bienes raíces son las células de las ciudades y que según un informe de UNPRI y de Vivid Economics, como pueden ver del lado derecho, que se realizó en febrero del 2020, este año, antes del COVID, se prevé que entre 2023 y 2025 tengamos un boom de legislaciones climáticas y de decarbonización y de economía circular que evidentemente incluyen al sector inmobiliario. Entonces necesitamos nosotros atender estos riesgos, pues porque imagínense, si esto fue planeado antes del COVID, ahora con el COVID quiere decir que esto solamente se va a acelerar y creo que todos lo estamos viviendo, o sea, inversionistas en toda Latinoamérica, bancos ya están pidiendo cuestiones que se alineen con TCFD, que se alineen con SASB, etcétera, y pues ya es, como les decía, obligaciones más que beneficios. Entonces, bueno, es por esto que quiero darle la palabra a nuestro súper invitado del día de hoy, nuestro amigo y experto, el profesor Drew Sanderford, quien nos va a explicar las tendencias globales ASG, la importancia del benchmarking incluyendo GRESB y por qué es importante para nuestra región. Quiero presumirles que el doctor Drew Sanderford es profesor bicentenario de finanzas inmobiliarias en la Universidad de Virginia Robert M. White Jr., estudia el desarrollo y las finanzas inmobiliarias en los giros comercial y residencial, y su trabajo actual explora cuestiones relacionadas con la estructura espacial y urbana y la relación de esta con el precio de los activos inmobiliarios. El profesor Sanderford da cátedra en finanzas en real estate y anteriormente ha dirigido clases para estudiantes de la maestría en desarrollo inmobiliario. Antes de unirse a la Facultad de Virginia, el profesor Sanderford estaba en la Universidad de Arizona, donde era presidente de la Facultad del Programa de Desarrollo de Bienes Raíces. Su investigación se publica en revistas académicas y profesionales, y el trabajo de Drew ha sido financiado por el National Science Foundation y el Real Estate Research Institute, y es miembro de la junta directiva de la American Real Estate Society. Estamos sumamente agradecidos con Drew de que nos acompañe hoy. Drew, it's a real pleasure that you're here. We are extremely honored with your presence. Thank you, and please go ahead. The audience is yours. Thank you very much.
Jess, thank you very much. It's very kind of you to say. Glad to be with everybody, and I hope everyone is very well and very safe. We could go to the next slide. That'd be terrific. So this is just a very familiar slide to many of you. This will be an outline. We'll talk a little bit about why I'm here, a little bit about the framework that I'll talk to you about, and then some opportunities. So we'll proceed relatively quickly here. Next, please. So one of my jobs as an academic is to help share a bit today, I think, about many things that you guys are already familiar with, and many of what you already know tacitly and implicitly from your participation in the market. But I thought it made sense to anchor the conversation so that my colleagues coming down the line can get increasingly more specific about what they'll share with you. So we'll start with the reality in which commercial real estate exists, right? We exist in a world that's warming. And we participate as commercial real estate actors in that. And so much of what I'll share is anchored in this scientific reality. So next, please. Commercial real estate's a really important part of the global climate conversation because it produces roughly about 80% of gross domestic product. It will be the home of about 2/3 of the future population in the world, right? And in that, it produces more than 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. Um, this is a really big and important space that we all work and contribute to. And one of my colleagues at Harvard, Ed Glazer, likes to say that cities are both the cause and the solution to the global climate problem. And so there's lots to be hopeful about. Next, please. Commercial real estate's also an important place to have this conversation because it's largely where many of us before COVID live our lives, right? We live, work, and play in cities. And so this is an important conversation all the way from the policy level down to individual households. So thanks for the chance to be here. It's really, really great to talk to you. And we'll start the next couple of slides. We'll talk a little bit about where we understand from a research perspective the ESG research to exist. And so what we know about ESG from a research perspective. But beware of academics coming to tell you about the future of the world. We're almost always wrong at making predictions into the future. And so this is just a slide to it's a little bit of a joke. It's sort of what we all learn as PhD students is we get increasingly better at describing what happened in the past. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about what we know from past data. Next, please. Okay, so we'll start on the supply side. And many of you who are familiar with C.B. Richard Ellis will be familiar with this index and this graph. This is a description of what the supply of environmentally or eco-certified real estate looks like in the United States. And this is just an indicator from one side. This is the multifamily side, but the office graph and the industrial graph look relatively similar, growing and getting stronger as time goes on. Next, please. And it looks pretty familiar as we go and look at a global perspective. And so this is 3 different eco-certification systems. This is LEED, BREEAM, and Green Star, or Green Mark rather. And you can see that this stuff, right? Your business is everywhere, right? So we're slowly gathering data about what's happening on a global perspective. And it's really, really exciting because it helps to be able to drive increasingly better research over time. Next, please. One of the best parts from the scientific perspective is that what we see on a supply side of the equation here is very similar to what we see in all types of new products and innovations. So the supply curve that we're able to see about eco-oriented real estate looks very similar to the general curve of all new goods and services. And so what we see is a relatively consistent scientific picture for how this stuff, your work, is folding out into the marketplace, which is really quite wonderful and helps us to understand a lot about what might come next. So we can't predict what might come next with a lot of certainty, but we may be able to anticipate a little bit. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and on the demand side, we see some really exciting things, right? We see investors, we see tenants, we see folks that live in cities, we see building owners, we see investment managers, all clamoring to include ESG as part of the future of their businesses. And so it's a terrific time to be studying this stuff because there are lots of different demand pulls from lots of different sides of the business. So you guys are in really terrific space, and that the data is unfolding in a much more holistic sense than it was, say, 10 years ago. Next slide, please. And I will summarize the entirety of what we know about the space from a research perspective in one graph, and it's hopefully hopefully very easy to read this. The summary is that across all asset categories, whether it's equity, debt, hotel, office, retail, and no matter where in the world we tend to find it, whether it's in the US, Europe, Latin America, Central Asia, South Asia, Australasia, right? We see that eco-certified real estate, environmentally oriented real estate, outperforms its traditional counterparts. And if we look, we can look at that on any number of metrics, but the good part about this story from a scientific perspective is that it converges, right? All of the signals point in similar directions, that this stuff, this business that you work in of environmentally oriented real estate really does have a material difference from its traditional counterparts. So quite a good space to be in from a research perspective, and quite optimistic too from a business perspective, looking out into the future. Jess, can we go to the next? One of the most important conclusions from the arc of the data that we've been able to gather, and I attribute this slide to work that was done by the founders of GRESB, is that the outperformance that we see in the data is durable over time. So what that means is that the number of snapshots we've been able to take with the data all add up and say the same thing, is that the outperformance is consistent, not only compared to traditional things at each moment, but over time. And that's an important indicator that this is materially different, both in actuality, but also over the time horizon, which is really a terrific story to be able to share with you. Next slide, please. Okay, but it's all kinds of things coming at you, right? There's all sorts of wonderful things on the horizon. And there's all kinds of ways to describe this. And the big question that is circling out there, that is each of you are trying to answer, and I will learn from you in the near future, is how do we deal with the question of materiality? And there are lots of ways to do it. And I think that one of the ways that you've started, if you're on this call, is you're working with GRESB. And that's a terrific way to encapsulate what's going on. And I think over time, what we'll see is a great deal of data integration and a great deal of sort of new understanding being built out of these key performance indicators and different certification systems. They'll help us understand what this idea of materiality is, and how you can report it to your investors and to your clients. Next slide, please. So there are some wonderful opportunities that exist out in the marketplace. This is where I get to speculate a little bit, but also to suggest that there's a lot of hope. And so I'm gonna look briefly at something here. So I think that the big opportunities exist largely in increasing the diffusion of disclosure, right? So essentially doing more of what we're already doing, but let's do it in some interesting and integrated ways. And let's also think about where science and industry can collaborate to measure the social and governance side of the equation, because there is a great deal more environmental and energy related research, but because that's where most of the data exists. But let's increase, through collaboration between science and industry, ways to measure and ways to disclose how we're working on the S and the G. And part of that, there's an opportunity in that for integrating how we work with students and employees in each of our companies to broaden our vocabulary and to consider what and how we do. So I think that there's also another opportunity to talk about urban form, which we can do at another time, but it's something for us to all to think about. And the last thing I'll leave you with is that I think one of the coolest parts about this particular segment of the marketplace is that we've started to engage in what's called double loop learning. And that's a way to question the paradigm in which business and science exist. And as we make experiments and get the feedback from each of them, we're able to sort of reimagine what the new paradigm moving forward from a business perspective looks like. And I believe that that's largely where GRESB has a significant advantage, is that it's able to integrate a number of different scientific indicators and sort of help sort of stabilize the data stream and standardize the data stream so that we're all able to question and move forward in a very positive direction together. So Jess, thank you very much for having me. I'm deeply excited to hear the rest of the presentations and to learn from the questions about where we can go from here.
Thank you very much, Drew. It has been a pleasure to hear you. I think for all of the audience to really understand what are global tendencies, at what we can do, and what are these opportunities of innovation that we all need to implement as soon as possible. So I'm going to switch to Spanish again. And okay, perfect. Okay, so now I'm very happy to introduce you Dan Winters. Dan is the head of Americas, and I'm going to present him in English for him to know. Dan is, well, I'm going to switch in Spanish, it's better. Dan es responsable de aumentar el alcance y el impacto internacional de GRESB mediante la participación de inversionistas institucionales en este assessment en la región de América. Y como representante de GRESB en esta región, cubre múltiples roles. Algunos de ellos es acelerar la adopción del mercado de datos ASG, promover una mayor participación que permita el desarrollo de nuevas oportunidades y productos, y también el comparar entre pares, que es uno de los objetivos de GRESB. Y bueno, anterior a estar en GRESB, Dan se desempeñó en el US Green Building Council como miembro senior de la estrategia empresarial y finanzas. La experiencia de Dan es en puestos importantes en Russell Real Estate y en CBRE. Dan obtuvo su maestría en desarrollo y financiamiento de bienes raíces en Harvard y su MBA en la Universidad Metodista del Sur. Es actualmente alumno del programa de bienes raíces de la Universidad de Wisconsin, y Dan fue también profesor de la Escuela de Bienes Raíces de Colvin en la Universidad de Maryland. Es actual consejero de bienes raíces, y la verdad es que también es un gran honor tenerlo como speaker hoy para nuestro primer webinar en la región latinoamericana. Dan, please go ahead, and thank you very much for being here.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much. You've really put together a great program for us. And I really liked having Drew lead off, right? He really hit on a number of high points, and his closing remark was great, right? Talking about basically what I think we're trying to do together, which is elevate structured data that's non-financial and do it in a way that we can make actions and we can make improvements and really tease out materiality, issues that are important to investors and issues that are important to the occupants of the buildings and the communities that they're in. So what I thought I'd do today is talk a little bit about how we got here and a little bit about who we are. So let's proceed with the slides. Yeah, perfect. Let's start here. So GRESB has been around since 2009, and we were formed out of academia. So the idea is, I think of things in three phases. So we had the first phase, the first 5 years of GRESB was all about market development and what does it mean, and then trying to define ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues that are tailored to institutional real estate. The next was, the next phase, the last 5 years, was all about industry adoption and getting folks to participate and move their, establish programs and move them forward. And now we're on the cusp of really looking forward as to what performance metrics matter. So let's take a look at the next slide, and you'll see really what our mission statement is and what we're all about. What we do fundamentally at GRESB is we assess and we benchmark the ESG performance, and we do it at a portfolio level, right? So portfolios are made up of many, many buildings. So once you bring all those buildings together and you think about the company that is responsible for owning, managing, developing, running those buildings, right? That's what we're trying to assess. And what we do is we offer the capital markets standardized and validated data. Again, structured non-financial data that really goes to inform how the financials came about. So you'll see on the next slide, some of our institutional investors that subscribe to our data. And the three that are circled here are our founders. So APG, PGGM, and USS got together in 2009, and they went and commissioned some academics, folks like Drew, to come up with what are the material aspects and what are the issues really that are important to institutional investors when they're making decisions as to who to allocate capital to. And after that capital allocation decision has been made, how do you engage with them and find out improvements that are happening in the portfolio to understand that these folks are really being good stewards of your capital? Those were the fundamental underpinnings of GRESB. And those ideas have started to attract, they've attracted many other institutional investors. So some of the logos that you see on the screen are our institutional investor members that subscribe to our data. There's over 100 of them, roughly 125. And they're really leading the way on driving and using capital to drive a more sustainable future. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have two different, there we go, good. We have two different product lines. We have the GRESB real estate assessment. That's how we started. And then in 2015, a number of our institutional investors came to us and said, you've been doing such a great job on the real estate assessment. Do you think you could create an infrastructure assessment? Because they both fall in the same bucket as the way that these folks think about things, under the bucket of real assets. So putting capital out the door and investing in toll roads, in airports, midstream pipes, as well as more what you might consider traditional sustainability investments, call it solar farms and wind farms, right? Those are the ideas behind infrastructure investing. And so they came to us and asked us if we could develop a benchmark for infrastructure. So that is now in the market for 5 years. And we've been doing a very good job attracting attention and growing that as well. So how do we do this? You'll see on the next slide how GRESB is set up with our governance structure. And this is a very important construct. So at the very top of GRESB are our institutional investors, and they really define and push forward what this assessment is all about. And on the other side, we have the people that respond, the participants of the assessment. They make up our benchmark committees. So GRESB is in the middle of these two groups. And we're navigating things that are important to institutional investors that they would like to learn from their fund managers. And we navigate the fund managers as to how their experiences with the assessment, areas that are maybe a little difficult for them, and trying to elevate some data that can be challenging. But either way, we're marshaling this force forward into the future. And it's been a really nice, synergy. So on the next slide, you'll kind of see the buckets that we operate under. So there's 4 of them. Let's see if we can, there we go. Right. So the first one are the institutional investors, the ones on the upper left. And what are they looking for? They're looking for ESG benchmarking data. They want to assess that non-financial data and help them understand really how those financials came about. They do this with the folks that are below, the participants, and those participants fall into 2 groups. They're usually, one of the 2 groups, there could be a listed company, right? A company that's traded on the stock exchange. The other are private equity funds. And either way, these groups own large portfolios of real estate. And what they're trying to understand is how well these firms are doing on ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues, and they do it in a way that peer benchmarks them. That's really the key construct of GRESB, is being able to see how this group is doing in comparison and in context with others that are pursuing the same strategies or have assets in the same geographic region. The third group are the real estate associations. Globally, there's roughly 25 of them. We have the support of all major trade associations around the globe who rely on GRESB for ESG expertise and education and things. They are a really important partner for us from an engagement standpoint. And then on the bottom right are experts in their field, typically in the geographic markets, folks like our hosts today who understand sustainability, are making it happen in the cities, states, and countries in which they exist. We also have data partners, because one of the most challenging things about GRESB is trying to elevate the energy, water, waste, and greenhouse gas emission consumption data for a portfolio. It might be it might be possible to find it for one building, but if you have a portfolio of 130 buildings or more, or even less, that's an awful lot of work. And it's a challenge. So we have this whole data ecosystem that has evolved up and grown up around GRESB and has evolved in helping us push the industry forward. So on the next slide, you'll get a sense of how GRESB was constructed. It's basically has the underpinnings in an ISO construct, which is Plan, Do, Check, Act. You know, what is a plan? It's all about having targets and policies, things that really define where you're going. And then the doing, right? Due diligence, underwriting, actions that are happening on the ground, efficiency projects that are rolling out either now or being planned for the future, right? And check, is there some kind of feedback loop that defines how you are making progress, and you can see where you are today and you can chart a course for the future. That's really the construct of GRESB. And we do this in a tailored approach for institutional real estate. So you'll see the aspects that underlie GRESB. And this year we made a big change. There's actually a couple more aspects. We parsed some things apart. So the performance section is a little bit more finite, a little bit more defined. And what we're really doing is setting the stage for the decade to come. To Drew's point about material aspects and how these consumption metrics are really sort of showing who's doing a great job when it comes to performance. That's where GRESB is heading. So on the next slide, you'll see just two screenshots of a question within GRESB. So the first question is ESG due diligence for new acquisitions. And you'll see that there are many things that organizations can do. I'm confident that everybody that's tuned in today does some of the things that are on this checklist. However, there's some real leading edge things here. Climate change analysis, what physical risk analysis, things that are real emerging as topics in the industry. And so when you go down this checklist, you'll be able to, I'm sure, know that you're doing some of the things. There's lots of random acts of sustainability that are happening in portfolios out there, but being able to systemize it and make it happen at all buildings, that's what these questions in GRESB are meant to do. They're meant to seed good ideas, because what this assessment is, it's a series of global best practices. So then when you look on the second one on the right-hand side, do the personnel at the firm have ESG performance targets that drive their thinking, that drive their compensation? And if so, who? Right? That's another very good idea. We're seeing that not only emerge, but really take hold in America and in Europe and other places. So now on the next slide, what you'll see is how this plays out in what a participant receives when they get their assessment results. We provide all of the participants with a benchmark report. And that benchmark report is a very granular, detail by detail, question by question. How did you do compared to your peers? And peer groups are defined by property type, geographic location, and whether the entity is a listed or a private equity fund. So it really allows organizations that feel like they're competing against other organizations for capital or for leadership within their city, state, or country, right? Some context as to how they're doing compared to peers. And what this is meant to do is help organizations go through some introspection when they receive the results, thinking about gaps, and plot a forward pathway to chart improvements. So you'll see on this report, this is available on our website. It's an example from a listed property company in the United States, Kilroy. They're based in Southern California, and they own office buildings. So you will see that they are number one in their peer group, and you can see their trend line. But I want you to pay attention on the lower left of this slide that their trend line, they weren't always number one. And so there's a process and a progress that happens with GRESB. It's the idea behind the framework. That's why we do this on an annual basis. You do the assessment, you get some results, you analyze where some gaps are, and you plan for the future. And you'll see how effective Kilroy was in doing that. Steep climb to basically #1 in 2015. And then you know what happens? They want to keep #1. So they keep doing more. And isn't that cool? So let's go to the next slide. And here's from a global participation standpoint, the folks, the numbers of participants. So back in 2009, when we did GRESB for the first time, it was a good idea. And 200 institutions completed the assessment and sent it in, and we benchmarked them and sent out that data. Every year, year on year on year, has been a climb. And this year, look at the slope of the graph. 1,230 participants in 2020. It's amazing, right? So ESG had momentum coming into the decade. We became rather concerned by the pandemic and what that might do to the priorities placed upon ESG. And what did we find? Acceleration. Pretty cool. So on the right-hand side, you'll see the number of funds by manager. There's an idea out here that if you're a fund manager, you have many, many funds that underlie your firm. So it's not just one company does one assessment. Aberdeen, they submit for 29 different funds. You'll see the bolded one, CBRE Investors, they have 42 different funds. So can you imagine somebody's workload to submit 42 different funds by July 1st every year? They can do it. And they've been doing a great job. And this just gives you some sense of the market and the big institutional investors that are participating in the GRESB assessment. Let's go to the next slide. And this is kind of a two-stager. So I talked about in the beginning the market development idea of the first 5 years of GRESB. Well, here's what that looked like. So what you'll see, each dot represents a participant and how they scored. And there's two axes. Axis 1 is management and policy. Do you have management procedures and things at the company level that are really defining and guiding what you're doing? Oftentimes not. Companies haven't really thought about these things and really codified them in a policy. On the other axis is implementation and measurement. So that is being able to access, acquire, and elevate data, typically consumption data, energy, water, waste, and greenhouse gas emission. And you'll see that there's a distribution of behavior. The first 4 years was a nice scatter plot of who's doing what. And we published reports every year along the way. How is the institutional investment industry doing on these issues? So if you go to the next slide, you'll see then the next 5 years. And what's nice about this slide is this straight up. So we had a little change in 2014. We altered the assessment a little bit, changed up a couple of questions. And then it's been this nice straight line growth from 2014 to 2019. And what's interesting is there's a clustering that's happening in the upper right. And so more and more firms are pushing forward, they're pushing their program and they're being rewarded via a score on the GRESB assessment. You're seeing these diagonal lines that are coming through the assessment. That's what defines the GRESB the GRESB universe of stars. There are 5 stars available. This is a mathematical idea. So the top 20% receive a 5-star, the next 20% receive a 4-star, all the way down to the GRESB 1-star. Now, 1 star means that you participated, that you're on your way, you're doing a great job. So a 1-star can be a tremendous thing, particularly for the first several years of participation. But make no mistake, everybody is really pushing to get into the upper right. That's where the action is. So let's go to the next slide. And all I'm going to do now is just show a couple screenshots with some resources so you can understand how to find out and learn more about GRESB. So if you click on the assessments and then you see on the right-hand lower part of that menu, our resources library, there's a tremendous amount of resources on GRESB. So let's click through these now. I think there's another 4 or 5 slides. And we can talk about, okay, so if you are looking for real estate, the reference guide, what is this assessment all about? The reference guide is a very voluminous document. Some people call it a cure for insomnia. But I encourage you to take a look. When you're looking at question 3 and you're like, well, what is the intent? What are the requirements to do question 3? That's what the reference guide is for. You can keep going. So on the next slide, you'll see the sample benchmark report. We had the screenshot of Kilroy, right? That is also available on our website, and you can dig into that and you can see exactly the kind of report that you'll receive after participating, hopefully in 2021. So on the next slide, you see that we have industry presentations that are available. There's a voluminous amount of good documentation on what GRESB is and what it means. And then on the last one here, right, we require asset level data as part of the submission. So there's an asset level spreadsheet. There's some guidance as to how to fill that out. And what we're attempting to do is harmonize, the ability to collect this data, not just in Europe, not just in Australia or America, but globally in your country. And so that's can be a little tricky. The asset level spreadsheet is meant to create a very level playing field for everybody, common definitions. Perfect. So then the treasure hunt of GRESB, right? There's all those resources out there. Take a look at our footer, and you'll see in the footer of the website that there is investor guidance for the participants, and most importantly, the timeline, right? We'll be publishing the 2021 timeline in the coming weeks. And you'll see the rhythm of GRESB. April 1st is a big date. That's when we open the assessment, and we close it on July 1st. On the next slide, a very important button to pay attention to, it's the login button. And so by clicking on that button, you can go and sign up and set up an account right now to get ready for April 1st, 2021. It's pretty easy to do. And, so then you're on your way. And then as we kind of round to the end here, I mentioned on the next slide, I mentioned asset level data being required for GRESB performance. So we started with the poll, right? So who does lead projects or Energy Star or other things? Those are all asset level ideas. GRESB is a company level, a portfolio level assessment, and it bubbles up information from the asset level and moving it on its way to the capital markets so investors can consume this in a very structured way to be able to do better and make better decisions. Okay, so now that we've started to speak about investors, just a handful of slides on what they're thinking about. If you go to the next slide, you'll see an awful lot of acronyms, a lot of neat logos. So there's CDP in the lower left, the Carbon Disclosure Project. That's all about trying to do carbon accounting for companies and for, including real estate companies. In the center is TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Very important emerging issue that many institutional investors are focused on. And back to Drew's point, those are the metrics that are really sought after to help organizations figure out this climate challenge that we all have. The Montreal Pledge right below that in 2014, 150 institutional investors got together and they signed this pledge. And the pledge was, we will do a carbon footprint report of our entire holdings by year-end 2020. And many of those institutional investors have joined GRESB in order to be able to acquire the data needed for their real estate and infrastructure portfolios to fulfill that pledge. Climate Action 100, Sustainable Development Goals, right? The UN Sustainable Development Goals, being able to map your portfolio against those goals, big topic that's happening in the institutional investment world. So let's go to the next slide because it's a really good segue to this. This graphic is showing the traditional way of investing. I will give you some capital, please manage it well, return that capital back to me after some period of time, typically 10 years, and we expect the capital back, we expect a return on that capital. What the changing paradigm has come and has really accelerated over the past 5 years is responsible, sustainable, and investing with an impact. And all of that requires metrics. What does it mean to be responsible? Well, that's solid risk management. What does it mean to be sustainable? That's seizing opportunities within the portfolio. And impacts are all about directed capital towards some particular set of outcomes that you might like, whether it's climate outcomes, whether it's outcomes on social issues, perhaps workforce housing. That's a common thing here in the United States, right? That's the whole idea. No, you can go to the last slide. The last slide is perfect. And this is the closing slide. Typically, and this is what drives people to participate in GRESB, right? It's either somebody asked your investor relations department, please complete this assessment, but more often we're seeing people that are curious. They have sustainability activities that are happening and they're looking for a way to collate and capture that on a portfolio level, right? Those are the curious. They get that score, you benchmark, you learn what your peers are doing, and it drives this, what I like to think of as a competitive race to the top. And at the end of the day, people move over to the right, which is looking for better risk management, better business value, and it's a continuous improvement cycle. GRESB is an annual assessment, wash, rinse, repeat. That was on Drew's slide early in his talk. And we do this on an annual basis to help organizations chart and make that progress. So thank you all very much for attending. At this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Jess. Thanks for allowing me to be here. Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Yeah, sorry for that. No, thank you, Dan. On the contrary, it is a pleasure to be moderating this. And really, I think it has been great that you have showed us how to move forward and what is GRESB about. And more importantly, that is a strategical tool to get in line of all the ESG initiatives that are out there to cover the 2030 and the 2050 agenda. And obviously that is real estate and infrastructure oriented. So that is great. And I think it's going to be very useful for the audience. And now, please, if you have any questions, I just want to remind you that the chat is over there. I'm going to switch to Spanish again. So les estaba diciendo que si hay alguna pregunta, por favor la pongan en el chat y ahorita al final las vamos a ver. Entonces, bueno, para continuar con nuestro programa, les quiero presentar, también tengo el gusto y el honor a Víctor Fonseca, que es analista de Real Estate en GRESB. Víctor tiene una maestría en Ciencias Arquitectónicas en la Universidad de Sydney, donde se enfocó en edificios de alto rendimiento. Además, antes de GRESB, Víctor trabajó con generación de energía renovable y apoyó el programa brasileño, Víctor es de Brasil, de incentivos para fuentes de energía renovable en electricidad, incluyendo energía hidroeléctrica, eólica y biomasa a pequeña escala. En GRESB él es responsable del análisis ASG de fondos inmobiliarios y la participación de los grupos de interés, que es también parte muy importante del assessment. Víctor también apoya la evaluación del ciclo de desarrollo anual de la evaluación de GRESB. Entonces, Víctor, es un placer que estés con nosotros y por favor puedes empezar. Thank you, Víctor.
Thanks, Jessica, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. Hi, everyone. I'm Victor. I work as a real estate analyst at GRESB, and I'll be presenting to you the 2020 real estate results. But before jumping into the results, I think it's very important to understand what does GRESB do. So GRESB is a by the industry for the industry benchmark. We represent investors' perspective on ESG. We apply it on our annual assessment, and then managers go ahead and complete it. GRESB then generates this ESG analytics both ways for investors and also for fund managers. And this is very interesting because it enables fund managers to understand the performance and also where is the gap, where there is room for improvement. And on the other hand, investors also have an overview of how their investments are performing. So basically, GRESB facilitates this engagement between investors and managers on the ESG conversation. Next slide, please. And how does GRESB do that? GRESB is a self-reported assessment, and participants should complete this throughout the reporting period. That usually starts in April and it goes until the end of June. And after participants submit their data, GRESB goes ahead and validates it, score it, and benchmark this data, providing business intelligence and engagement tools to investors and fund managers. So GRESB is an engagement mechanism that works both ways. Fund managers in one side, investors in another side. Next slide, please. So this is the 2020 real estate assessment structure. It's divided in 3 components, and participants can complete any possible combination of these components, either all of them or one of them. But in order to receive a GRESB score and a benchmark report, managers need to complete either the management component and the performance component together, and then they will receive a standard investment benchmark. Or they can complete the management components and the development components, and they will receive the development benchmark. In case you complete all of them, you will receive two different GRESB scores and two different benchmarks. But the focus of this presentation today will be on the standard investment benchmark. In addition, it is very important to emphasize that this was the first year that GRESB made mandatory the reporting of some aspects in the asset level, which increases data quality by a lot and also increases the reporting granularity. Next slide, please. So GRESB collects this asset level data, as Dan previously said, by the asset spreadsheet through a set of metrics that you can see listed here as in these bullet points. For example, energy consumption across all energy types, GHG emissions also across scope 1, 2, and 3, water consumption, waste management, among many others. So what GRESB do after that, they aggregate all this information and they provide analytics on environmental footprint, such intensities, consumption, emissions, among others, for both property type level and also your entire portfolio. Next slide, please. So now that we talked about what GRESB do, let's jump into the results. We can see here the participation rate graphs that has on the horizontal axis the years, and on the vertical axis the number of funds that reported to GRESB in these respective years. Latin America has 19 funds, 8 funds from Mexico, 9 from Brazil, 1 from Chile, and another one that has the portfolio spread out through the region, so we don't have a country classification. But when we compare these graphs and the participation rate of Brazil and Mexico with the global participation rate, or even the Americas participation rate, it's possible to see that this number remained pretty much constant over the last few years. But I'm confident that after this event and with the help of PIMA, we'll see a jump of these values starting from next year. And I would also like to emphasize that in case you are uncertain if you should participate because you're not familiar with ESG or you don't want your investors to see your results in the first place, GRESB allows first-year participants to make the use of grace period, which allows participants to submit a GRESB assessment without providing GRESB investor members with access to these results. So the grace period is basically a trial run that you can do while actually reporting to GRESB, giving you 1 year to familiarize with the GRESB reporting and also the assessment process. So if it's your first time reporting on ESG, don't worry, we got your back here. Next slide, please. So this is the GRESB model, which is very interesting, and Dan mentioned it in one of his slides. This showed the distribution of GRESB score for the participants that have reported both the management and the performance component. You can see that every light gray dot represents one reporting entity score. So let's understand how this graph is. On the horizontal axis, it's the normalized performance score of these entities. And the vertical axis is the normalized management score of these entities. This means that the best performance scores will be seen in the far right of the graph, and the best management score can be seen on the top of the graph. Looking at it, we can see a higher concentration of reporting entities in the upper part of the graph, meaning they have performed pretty well in the management components. But it's also plotted in this graph, the global average, America's average, and also the Brazilian and the Mexican average, that, as I mentioned before, is the main ones that constitute Latin America at GRESB universe. You can see that the global average is as the green dot, which is slightly higher than the US average. And also it is possible to know that America's average is very close to the US average. And that's why the US represents the majority of the GRESB America's universe. But Mexico and Brazil position are biased because of the sample size. As I've mentioned before, we only have 9 funds from Brazil and 8 funds from Mexico. But still, it's very interesting. For example, you can see that Brazil have a higher average than actually the global and the Americas average this year, which is pretty interesting. Next slide, please. As Professor Drew mentioned earlier on his presentation, there's much more research material focusing on the environmental pillar than the social and the governance one. We can see that this is also reflected at GRESB by looking at the pie chart on the left-hand side. GRESB is a very competitive benchmark on environmental indicators, having the environmental pillar totalizing 62% of the total score for the standard investment benchmark, while social pillar represents 18.5% and the governance 19.5%. Looking to the bar chart now on the right side, we can see how did these regions scored out of the total score dedicated for the environmental pillar in the green bar, the social pillar in the blue bar, and the governance pillar in the orange bar. If you further analyze it, we see that Latin America actually performed better than Americas in the environmental indicators, but significantly lower when it comes to the social indicators and the governance indicators. We can look at the bright side, right? There are plenty of room for improvement, and that's one of the main reasons that of this event here today. Next slide, please. Here we can have a different overview of the scores for Americas and Mexico, for example. The background green shade represents the average score per aspect for the Americas, while the darker green line outlines the average score for Mexico. The wind roses slices size represents the weights of the respective aspects within the total score of the assessment for the standard investment benchmark. If we look at it, we can note that Mexico performs better than Americas in a few aspects, such as reporting with an average score of 94%, risk assessment with an average score of 84%, and GHG emissions with an average score of 69%. Also targets, data monitoring review, and tenants and communities. Next slide, please. So the GRESB benchmark report is the flagship output that GRESB provides, but we can do much more than that. So GRESB participants that report to us the ESG data at the asset level can have further insights and planning that leads into action. As an example, here you can see the decarbonization pathways extracted from CREM, one of the materiality tools that Professor Drew had in his previous slide. And if you look at it on the left-hand side, you can see Brazil decarbonization pathway for both scenarios of 1.5 and 2 degrees aligned with the Paris Agreement. On the right-hand side, you can see Mexico's, like the same, the 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees scenario. These decarbonization pathways targets can be plotted alongside with your asset level data and generate insights that can lead into action. And this enables participants to do such things like target setting, which means like set targets for your emission reductions, renewable energy procurement, or you can do scenarios alignment analysis. Should I retrofit my builds? And if yes, when? Also transition risk assessment, which is kind of linked with TCFD recommendations. So when will my assets become stranded? When should I start to transition to renewable energy? Also net zero alignment. So you can, by plotting your GHG emissions projections, you can have a better understanding on how you will be performing in the upcoming years. So in conclusion, this is only one example of how GRESB data can be used afterwards, but there are many more ways to use it. Next slide. So I'd like to thank you. I hope this presentation was insightful for those who are starting the conversation on ESG and also for those who are now developing their ESG strategies. Please feel free to contact me, send me any question. I'll be happy to assist any further. And hopefully I'll see some of you reporting to GRESB next year and make your first step as a long-term path to disseminate ESG in Latin America and making the real estate industry more sustainable It was a pleasure, and over to you, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you, Victor, very much. I think it was extremely interesting to get to know this data. And let me switch to Spanish. Lo que les quiero decir es que lo que Víctor ahorita nos dijo es súper importante porque podemos ver cómo sí un assessment como GRESB, sobre todo que está especializado en bienes raíces, puede ayudarnos a dar un diagnóstico de nuestras empresas. Lo que dijo del periodo de gracia me parece sumamente importante porque el primer año, como mencionó, pueden participar sin que sus resultados sean públicos y eso es una gran oportunidad para que pues ustedes puedan ver cómo están. Incluso ahorita vamos a decirles unos tips de cómo empezar, que es la última sección, y para ello quiero dar la bienvenida a nuestro último ponente, que es Orlando Araúz Muñoz, que es nuestro gerente de sostenibilidad en PIMA y también es nuestro amigo. Orlando es ingeniero ambiental con una especialidad en ingeniería sostenible. Fue seleccionado por la Universidad de Washington y de Stanford para desarrollar proyectos sostenibles. Previo a ello, él trabajó en Iberdrola en el área de ambiental y para la GIZ y ha participado en proyectos de cambio climático de la Semarnat y en el gobierno de la Ciudad de México, así como el Colegio de Ingenieros Ambientales. Entonces me da muchísimo gusto tenerte aquí, Orlando. Gracias por ayudarnos y adelante.
Muchas gracias, Jess. Hola a todos, un gusto estar aquí y bueno, como ya mencionó Jess, el día de hoy les voy a compartir un poco sobre nuestra experiencia como PIMA Consultores a lo largo de esta aventura GRESB y cómo hemos podido ayudar a responder la evaluación GRESB con nuestros clientes y lograr solidificar la estrategia de ambiental, social y gobernanza corporativa para sus portafolios. Hemos decidido generar esto a partir de una estructura, esos tips a partir de una estructura como más organizada en estos 6 pasos que nos van a permitir realizar el assessment de GRESB de una manera más eficiente. Y lo primero que les vamos a recomendar aquí es que se inscriban al newsletter de GRESB. Aquí podrán mantenerse al día con las novedades, actualizaciones, evaluaciones, actualizaciones de la evaluación, fechas, artículos, webinars como este, que es el primero de una serie que tendremos para la región junto con GRESB. Gracias a este newsletter van a poder estar al día de lo que sucede. Entonces es como la primera recomendación que tendríamos para ustedes. La segunda sería poder definir cuál es el sector en el que están desarrollando sus actividades, ya sea en el de infraestructura o el de inmobiliario, porque ambas tienen una forma de evaluación distinta para GRESB. El punto número 3 es, y como ya lo mencionaron previamente, tema específicamente, es poder tener acceso a los materiales que GRESB pone a nuestra disposición en línea. Desde la guía para el participante con un desglose de todas las preguntas de cómo presentar evidencias sólidas, la estructura esquemática del cuestionario y demás. También encontrarán un cronograma de la evaluación con fechas importantes, con todo como fechas del periodo de reporteo, fechas de revisión, fechas de resultado, etcétera. También van a encontrar la misma evaluación GRESB 2020 que va a servir como guía para poder gestionar la evaluación del próximo año, con pequeños cambios, por supuesto. Una capacitación en línea, muy buena, que está subtitulada a español y eso puede facilitar bastante las cosas. Y también es importante mencionar que hay una guía de calificación o una guía de puntuaje que nos va a permitir poder darnos una idea de dónde estamos o cuál va a ser nuestra calificación con base a los estatus de GRESB para poder implementar o mejorar nuestra estrategia ASG. Como punto número 4, y uno de los más importantes de toda esta aventura GRESB, es poder realizar un diagnóstico. Lo primero que deben de hacer es descargar el cuestionario 2020 y empezar a familiarizarse con la plataforma y sus preguntas para poder evaluar qué componente desean reportar, ya sea el componente de management, performance o development o la combinación de algunas de estas. Una vez hecho esto, es importante dividir cada una de las preguntas que nos ofrecen en cada una de las áreas que tiene la empresa. Recursos humanos, finanzas, relación con inversionistas, asset y property managers, desarrollo, compliance, GRESB es transversal y todas las áreas tienen que aportar a esto. Es fundamental entablar canales de comunicación adecuados para poder gestionar respuestas y evidencias sólidas necesarias. Les queremos comentar también que GRESB solicita datos por activos y datos a nivel portafolio. Datos como el Gross Asset Value, áreas de distribución de las propiedades, consumos de energía, agua, residuos, muy importantes, para poder, y todo esto es para estar preparados. La fecha límite para poder complementar esto, esta evaluación es julio 1, como mencionaron ahorita, en abril 1 abren el assessment y en julio 1 se cierra. Entonces, les recomendamos tener que como por lo menos un mes de antelación toda la información recopilada para poder confirmar y revisar de manera interna para poder publicarlo en GRESB. GRESB basa sus preguntas en políticas, métricas y estándares de desempeño internacional. Eso sería el punto 5 y 6. En la industria, GRESB, como les mencionaba, GRESB basa sus preguntas en políticas, métricas y estándares de desempeño a nivel internacional en la industria. Esto es un parteaguas para determinar el estatus de tu compañía en temas ambiental, social y de gobernanza, en gobernanza corporativa, en comparación con tus pares en la industria. Al registrarte como participante, tendrás acceso a los recursos, serás parte de la comunidad de GRESB, etcétera. Tendrás un canal directo de comunicación con ellos para poder gestionar todos estos temas. Por lo que ahora les invitamos a iniciar en esta gran aventura frente a un negocio sostenible en el tiempo. Y bueno, más que nada quería agradecerles por esa parte y también mencionar que en este slide estamos resumiendo todos los puntos que acabo de mencionar con unos enlaces o unos links para que les sea más fácil acceder a todos estos tips que les hemos recomendado. De todas formas, nosotros siempre estamos muy atentos para lo que sea adecuado o necesario. Y bueno, por último y extremadamente importante, por favor, en la última slide, les recomendamos tener un equipo o un líder de sostenibilidad que pueda apoyar a gestionar todo esto en tiempo, forma, para tener evidencias sólidas y calificación adecuada frente a sus pares. Y bueno, básicamente sería eso. Muchísimas gracias, Jess. Y bueno, también quedamos atentos. Si tienen alguna duda o comentario, con toda la confianza del mundo pueden acercarse a nosotros para poder gestionar el tema. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Orlando. También pues es muy importante que ustedes sepan cómo empezar. Creo que se resumió perfecto los pasos. Ahí están todos los links, entonces es muy importante que ustedes entren. La verdad es que están muy fáciles de revisar, pero sí es bastante información. Como dijo Dan, puede ser un tema cuando tengan insomnio, pero es importante que los revisen, ¿no? Bueno, entonces ahora para terminar, pues es muy importante que ustedes nos digan qué preguntas tienen. Por favor, aquí ya teníamos alguna pregunta, déjenme revisar. Bueno, si quieren por vía chat la pueden mandar. Voy a hacer la que ya tenemos por aquí. Entonces, la primera es de Fernando Lozano, quien nos pregunta qué tendencias existen en materia de energía renovable y si las desarrolladores integran estas tecnologías en la vivienda o en su operación. Me parece que voy a dar esta pregunta a Víctor Fonseca y si no, nosotros la podemos contestar. Víctor, I'm going to tell you the question in English. Is that what are the trends in renewable energy that are happening in the industry? And if the construction companies are integrating these technologies specifically to the homes or residential sector? Also in offices or in commercial real estate. Can you tell us about this?
Hi, Jessica. Yeah, Charles, I can see Charles already answered the question, but I'm happy to answer it again. So I will echo what Charles said. Some developers already integrate renewable energy in the design stage. And so on-site renewable energy in this case. And we do capture this on our assessment, but we didn't mention this today. We focus on the standard investment benchmark. But when it comes to the development benchmark, we do capture, like if you consider renewable energy in your design stage, and this is covered by our assessment in the indicator D, E, and 2.1. And when it comes to trends, it's mainly we capture the renewable energy type when it comes to the standard investment, so the operational part of the real estate. So the trends I can tell you about the standard investment is that mainly is the landlord who procures the renewable energy. Tenant plays a very minor part when it comes to it.
May I add some more context? May I?
Yes, of course.
Oh, good. So what we're watching happen in the larger institutional real estate industry is a big push to net zero. And the first thing that you need to do is define, benchmark where you are, and then put together some plan. Say, how are we going to get there? So there are certainly on-site renewable opportunities, and anything that has a very large roof space, industrial, retail, right, is more native to being able to do that. Office is a little bit harder, particularly for vertical buildings. But the first step is to benchmark. And then you do things on site with your operations to reduce that energy footprint. And then you start to procure offsite renewable energy from your service provider. So that's the methodology that folks are starting to pursue in order to get to some proximity to net zero, or even net positive is being discussed. And that's a trend to really watch out for. It's going to take hold over the next 2 years, and we're going to start to see it in the data by the time we get to 2025.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dan. And I also have another question for Drew. Drew, as a responsible fiduciary, how do you think these portfolio managers companies should start training or getting better in ESG standards in terms of education? Do you have any suggestions or tips for them to start to dig better into these topics? Moreover, in topics related with climate change, resilience, and performance in E aspects, what are your suggestions?
Thank you. That's a very, very good question. And I think if the academy could tilt towards it, I think we'd all be in much better shape. I think the root of the question is that there needs to be a deeper conversation between industry and the academy, right? Folks in your chair and folks in my chair need to talk to one another with more frequency and with more earnesty so that we can harmonize. And I think GRESB is a really terrific example of how that can emerge, that conversation can emerge. And so to the extent that we can train people better, I really think that it's a terrific way to go to your local university and ask to talk to the folks in the finance department, in the economics department, in the design department, and start the conversation where you need information, to help the academics understand where the questions for business exist, so that they might be able to use the research skills and the classroom time to help students to point towards the answers. So I think it's really one of those interesting, it needs to be pushed, and it needs to be pushed by both sides, but it really is just a deeper integration of conversation between industry and academy.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I'm going to translate your answer into Spanish. It's not going to be perfect, but anyway, I will do my best. So what Drew said, lo que dijo Drew, yo le pregunté que cómo creía que nosotros como empresas podemos entrenar mejor a nuestra gente, incluso a la cadena de suministro, para enfrentar estos cambios, sobre todo en aspectos de cambio climático y resiliencia. Entonces, lo que él sugiere, que la verdad yo creo que es muy bueno, es que vayamos a las universidades locales, preguntemos cómo están también ellos haciendo investigación de esto, les contemos sobre nuestras necesidades y podamos entonces usar lo que ellos están generando para cuestiones de negocio. Creo que es excelente. Y yo me gustaría añadir a eso que nosotros con nuestra experiencia como PIMA hemos estado entrenando a más de 4,000 personas en nuestros 15 años de experiencia en temas ASG y que recomendamos vital el que año con año ustedes capaciten a quien más puedan en estos temas, tanto de manera interna como de manera externa, y que lo hagan de forma continua para que entonces puedan estar involucrados. Con la ayuda de GRESB, como dijo Drew, es excelente para que puedan darle una estructura a donde más les haga falta esta capacitación. Y bueno, como última pregunta, I'm going to ask Dan. Dan, as the last question, I just want to ask you, what do you think are the GRESB main advantages for the Latin American market? More taking into account that even when we only generate 5% of the greenhouse gases emission of the world, we are in a very sensitive geographic location in terms of climate change, and so that we need to accelerate these changes. So can you tell us about this?
Sure. My reaction to that is that this assessment and this framework has now been out there for 10 years. And so it's been put forward in the marketplace. It's a series of global best practices. So if you're looking for a place to start, because these are the issues of our time and the issues that we all care about, this is a really good place to get in, understand what the global industry is doing, to start to really push forward on these issues. And it's filled with good ideas. So those best practices, when you start to embed them and instill them within your organization, make the organizations that do it on the pathway to being part of the solution and less being part of the problem. So I like to think that we've been at this now for 10 years. We have many more than 10 years to go, right? And GRESB will continue to evolve. So here we are in 2020, and we're working to elevate this data and move to metrics that folks care about. And it's really going to drive institutional investors to, let's say, vote with their pocketbook. Say, you know what, this is a solid firm that's delivering solutions on these issues. This is a firm that's managing risk in a great way, and they've embraced global best practices. So I'd like to say that GRESB is that framework. We don't offer the solution, we offer the help to get there along the way, and we do this collectively with everybody. It's not just about us, it's about all of us.
Thank you, Dan, very much. I think just very quick, because we need to wrap up, I'm going to move to the conclusions. So thank you. The conclusions, perdón, nada más voy a traducir lo que dijo Dan. Yo le pregunté que pues cuál eran las ventajas para Latinoamérica de GRESB. Él nos comentó que GRESB tiene 10 años en el mercado y que entonces pues ya es una estructura muy sólida de lo que globalmente se está haciendo en real estate en términos de ASG. Entonces empezar por GRESB es un excelente primer paso. Y bueno, para pasar a las conclusiones, lo que les queremos decir es que, como pueden ver, el índice de GRESB definitivamente puede ser un punto de referencia para mejorar el desempeño ASG, tanto internamente como frente a sus pares. Otro punto es que ya hemos visto que el tema de ASG es muy necesario para detectar oportunidades ESG y para informar de manera continua y sólida sus avances a todos los grupos de interés, los inversionistas, los arrendatarios, la comunidad, etc. Seguir en el camino para poder cumplir esta Agenda 2030 y 2050 y disminuir los riesgos y el valor para su empresa y sus grupos de interés. Es súper importante, sé que este año COVID ha sido más que loco, entonces sabemos que nos la hemos pasado reportando la mayor parte del tiempo y que tenemos apenas un mes ahorita para implementar, pero es súper importante que de aquí, o sea, les sugeriríamos que bajaran el assessment, lo revisaran y vieran en dónde salieron bien los que ya se calificaron o los que no, hacer un análisis interno y ver en dónde están bien y dónde no, para poder hacer lo que puedan hacer en este mes y estar muy atentos al portal del GRESB en abril 1, que se lanza el nuevo assessment, pues para poder contestarlo de la mejor manera. La última frase que queremos dejar aquí es que, pues, lo más que nos tardemos en estos cambios y transformaciones que ahorita son súper necesarios pues para sobrevivir y para seguir como planeta y como negocio, pues más disruptivo va a ser cómo los tengamos que hacer. Entonces, les sugerimos ser súper proactivos con todas las áreas de su empresa que lo tengan que hacer, exigir con sus CEOs y sus comités estos cambios, porque pues de esta manera podremos tener mejores oportunidades de negocio en el futuro súper cercano, ¿no? Ya no estamos hablando de que tenemos 20 años ni nada, estamos hablando de 3, 5 años para poder estar mejor. Este es el momento de que nosotros, que somos los agentes de cambio en esta industria sostenible, hagamos los cambios necesarios y que podamos ser, pues orgullosamente, la verdad es que a nosotros nos fascina estar en esta industria, los agentes de esta transformación. Entonces, les damos las gracias. Quiero dar las gracias a Ana, Roberto y a Sasha, quienes nos estuvieron ayudando para hacer este webinar, y a Charles, porque pues esto ha sido excelente. Dan, Víctor, Drew, de todo corazón les damos las gracias, Orlando, Vanessa, y pues estamos aquí para apoyarlos y la verdad es que creo que ha sido un éxito este primer webinar. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Hasta pronto a todos.
Hasta luego.